Coming up, we're going to talk to Alan Tolhurst, Chief Reporter at Politics Home, because they're still grappling with the problem here in the Labour Party, in the government, of what to do about Donald Trump, because almost every senior cabinet member of Keir Starmer's government has slagged him off in a pretty nasty way over the course of the last few years. And now they're going to have to run backwards at 100 miles an hour because they have to deal with him, possibly sooner rather than later. This is Morning Glory. Let's get it on. I mean, you've got to say, Angela Rayner is not exactly a person who holds back on what she thinks and what she does and what she says. And here she is talking about Donald Trump just a few years ago.
Donald Trump is killing, thousands of Americans by giving them duff advice, and his macho, I'm all right, look at me, I've survived COVID, is an absolute buffoon. He has no place in the White House. He's an embarrassment, and he should be ashamed of himself.
Yeah, he's an embarrassment. He should be ashamed of himself. You might say the same thing about Angela Rayner, mightn't you? I mean, even Keir Starmer has been at it. He's been having a go. David Lammy's been having a go. Wes Streeting's been having a go. I mean, it's really quite embarrassing. Here's what Keir Starmer said in 2019 because of Boris Johnson. He said, an endorsement from Donald Trump tells you everything you need to know about what is wrong with Boris Johnson's politics and why he isn't fit to be Prime Minister. One from Wes Streeting. Trump is such an odious, sad little man. Imagine being proud to have that as your president. That was in 2017. Ed Miliband in 2016. Racist, misogynist, self-confessed groper just won the presidency. And then he says in 2016, he said to the BBC, the idea that we have shared values with a racist, misogynistic, self-confessed groper beggars belief. Well, thanks, guys. And here we are. It's absolutely extraordinary stuff. Alan Tolhurst is here, Chief Reporter at Politics Home. Alan, there's a very rich vein of all of this. I mean, it's not as if there's just one comment from one sort of, loose-lipped member of the cabinet. It seems to be bloody all of them.
Yeah, and actually, both sides there was quite a lot of Conservatives were quite critical of him. I think Boris Johnson once said that Donald Trump was completely out of his mind about comments he made about London. So I think there's been a lot of people who had to kind of walk it back. I think that the issue for the government is probably actually not going to be Donald Trump itself. It's probably people around him who are probably going to be more annoyed about this stuff. I think from what we've heard about, what we've known of Donald Trump, I spoke to someone who worked in the Theresa May administration that dealt with him during his first term and said that actually it's not that he really holds a grudge. I think actually, if you say these, they say these rude things, but actually, if you then kind of, grease up to him and sidle up to him and say the right things. Yeah, that he does actually seem to quite like it. I mean, there's a great piece in the Sunday Times from Tim Shipman talking about when Keir Starmer and David Lammy went to visit Donald Trump in September. And it did seem to go pretty well. Apparently, Donald Trump even offered David Lammy second helpings of their dinner. And at the end of it, he said to Keir Starmer that you are now my friend, which is, is quite a big deal. And I think Donald Trump is very transactional. And I think he's able to kind of push past that. In a sense, he might even like a situation where he perhaps has something over these politicians.
I was saying this. Yeah, I was saying this earlier that actually now he would prefer it because he knows that Keir Starmer and David Lammy are slightly embarrassed to be in his company because of what they said about him. Because we've all been there, haven't we? You walk into a party, you walk into a room, and there's the guy that you were just tweeting about, call him an idiot, and you go, "Oh, what do I do now?" And you can either go up to him and go, "Hey, how's it going?" Or you can just try and ignore him and hide in the other corner. So Trump, I think, quite enjoys that. In a way, I certainly would enjoy it if I can meet somebody who's slagged me off on Twitter. It's all great fun. But in the end, he will have power over them. One, because he's President of the United States of America, but also two, because they can't keep that up. They cannot continue to slag him off because they now have to be respectful and they now have to do business with him. Yeah,
exactly. I don't think you'd be very surprised to see any of those sorts of comments you read out to come from members of who are actually part of the cabinet in a government that has to deal with a Donald Trump administration. I think we will see a definite different tone in things. And I think, obviously it's quite embarrassing at the moment. David Lammy, in that big newscast interview that's out this morning, all those comments are read back to him and he doesn't even sort of recant really. He just says, oh, they're old news and tries to push past that. Yeah. I think actually that probably is the right thing to do, because if you start getting into a situation where you're having to sort of walk them back and say you didn't mean them you didn't mean them, etc., etc., you get themselves in a right pickle. I think the best thing to do, take the Donald Trump approach, which is just push straight past that and move on to the next thing. I think that's probably what they're going to try and do. They've obviously got big issues to deal with him, not just on kind of all the big foreign policy issues, but also things like tariffs and trade and all those kind of issues around security as well. They're going to have to deal with. So I think, best thing to do is just, not pretend you never said them, but just try and breeze past them as quickly as possible.
Yeah, quite. I mean, he certainly tried to do that on Wednesday, didn't he, when Kemi Badenoch was asking whether Donald Trump had received an apology from Lammy on that visit, or whether if he hadn't, the Prime Minister might offer one now. And he sort of almost started heckling her as a result of what she was saying, as if he didn't really believe in anything she was saying. So he's got a bit of a brass neck as Lammy. He seems to spend most of his time now travelling around the world doing sort of jollies. I mean, he was in South Africa, I think, yesterday, talking about how Africa is the future. He's now going to do business with Africa. He's going to create jobs in Africa and here, so that's the new sort of powerhouse. But he's barely been. I think he's been away more than he's been here, hasn't he?
Well, I suppose that's a good being a good foreign secretary, being away around the world. That's kind of your role, I suppose. And I think that's what you've got to do in the first few months. You've got to get yourself out there. He wasn't necessarily a well-known politician in the UK, and certainly wasn't well-known around the world before he took on that role. So I think you've got to get out there and do as much as you can, try and build those diplomatic ties. And I think as well, this government is going to try and approach things slightly differently from the Conservative administration, which probably means creating new relationships out there. So he's probably racking up the air miles as we speak.
I mean, Trump's been the big story this week, but of course last week the big story was Rachel Reeves and her budget. This morning the Telegraph sees fit to still make her the main story. They say Reeves is driving up prices, warns the Bank of England. Basically, tax and spend budget has piled pressure on families while the US enjoys a market boom, they say. The Bank of England warning Britain is facing a fresh rise in inflation. I mean, that would not be something that would be good for Rachel Reeves, because she was only yesterday out there talking about the interest rates coming down and how careful she was being with the economy, and how this is good news for companies, for businesses, and for ordinary citizens who had mortgages. But if inflation starts to creep up again, she's going to get the blame.
Absolutely, and inflation, as we've seen in elections, both in the US this week, but also all through this year, post-pandemic, inflation has been the absolute kind of killer of government. Essentially, every incumbent government that has had an inflationary spike has been booted out by the electorate. So any return to inflation would be a disastrous for this Labour government. Would not just kind of kill potential growth or wipe out growth by those inflationary rises, but I think as well, like you say, Rachel Reeves especially, and this government would massively get the blame for it, because clearly there are links with, you can't sort of say, it's global pressures or it's pandemic or whatever. Clearly the inflationary pressures that might happen now will be linked back to her budget and her economic strategy, so therefore they'll get the blame for it. And we know that if you hurt people in the pocket, they'll then hurt you at the ballot box.
Yeah, exactly right. And Keir Starmer still sort of getting to grips with the job, it seems. I mean, for him, I suppose it's not been a terrible week. He went off to Budapest to have his meeting with various different European leaders, including Volodymyr Zelensky, of course, as well, from Ukraine. And, there were all sort of joint declarations coming out about, what they're going to do about Ukraine, how they're going to deal with Donald Trump. But, I mean, for him, it's been relatively quiet, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think the big boost for him was managing not to call the person opposite him at Prime Minister's questions Prime Minister by accident. I think
well done,
he's managed to,
well done.
Yeah, thankfully, obviously, having Kevin Badenoch opposite him meant that he managed to not do that, as he's done virtually every week since he took over. So yeah, it's been a fairly kind of quiet. Well, obviously, they've obviously been watching what's happening in America and the strategy behind that, because as I was mentioning, it doesn't just affect kind of things like Zelensky in Ukraine. It has a massive impact. We know what Trump's been saying about tariffs, and we know obviously how big trade is with America, and therefore the fear is that that's going to happen. And I think that's why David Lammy was talking about it as well. I think that's kind of where, if there is to be a better relationship, I think when it comes to trade, I think that's where they need to go, because that's obviously going to have a massive impact. When we talk about economic growth and stuff, if you can strike up, there's not going to be a kind of big, massive trade agreement with America, but there could be a kind of carve-outs on various areas to make sure that we don't end up kind of bearing the brunt of any tariffs that come from a new Trump administration. Yeah,
I mean, one story that sort of popped out at me today, which is not particularly political one, but I'm going to bring it up with you anyway because it has to do with HS2. Story in the Times today. Apparently,
is this the Batcave? Is this the Batcave?
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, it's just an amazing story. The rail project itself is expected to cost more than £66 billion, right? Despite the fact that the legs to Manchester and Leeds have been scrapped and it's been plagued by controversy. But it turns out that HS2 has spent more than £100 million building a shed for bats. I mean, I kid you not, the chairman of the government-owned company said, despite no evidence its trains will harm them.
It's incredible, and I think I've seen some pretty extravagant sheds over the past sort of 10 years. Men building these kind of sheds in their garden. £100 million, I think, is probably by far the most expensive. And I think it's just kind of really emblematic of something that I'm kind of really passionate about. Is that the lack of ability in this country to build anything, to actually do anything. Since 1945, we've built one extra runway at an airport, and that was Manchester in the 90s built their second runway. We just can't build anything like that, and every time that Heathrow rejects plans to build a third, or there's rejected plans to build a third runway, the person who runs Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam sends a massive cake to the person who runs Heathrow Airport to say thank you. And that's also, and this is a classic example. Our rail infrastructure has not been improved at all, and HS2 was meant to be this big project, and it's becoming this massive white elephant. And it's going to be preposterous as you pull out of Euston and you go north. You're going to go under the most expensive shed in the world, which is to protect bats that aren't even at risk at all.
No, I mean, I didn't realise that bats were such an important part of our environment, but apparently, because I did this story just last week, there's a excuse me, they're talking about doing away with street lighting because bats don't like it.
Well, it's good to know that policy is being decided by the bat community, which also the bats that are the species that are involved in this bat shed on I have to be very careful how you say that, bat shed.
If you say bat shed really quickly, that's exactly what it sounds like.
On HS2, they're not those ones. They're apparently they're endangered in other parts of the world, but they're not endangered in the UK. There are lots of them in the UK, and we have lots of other species. And so, therefore, I do understand making sure that you have a kind of, you understand the impact on wildlife when you do these big projects. But this, I mean, the fact is that the person, this all came out because the person who's running HS2, was they're the ones who are so frustrated with it. They're trying to get this stuff done, and they're being held back by all this kind of stuff. And there's been lots of stories over the years about the cost of all these compulsory purchases and trying to bulldoze through land and all this kind of stuff. And in the end, HS2. If we ever even get to see it properly open, it's going to be emblematic of the massive problems that we have in building this stuff. And you look at something like Crossrail in London, which did get built. It's now the 6th busiest railway line in the country because of its ability. Once we got it done, these things do work. It just takes so long to actually get it done.
Well, exactly right. I mean, I can't remember the last motorway that was built. I mean, I'm sure there is a more modern one on the M25, but as soon as it was built, it was already obsolete. And there we go. And it's not big enough. It's already just going to be jammed all over the place. Alan, that's a great talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Alan Tolhurst, chief reporter at Politics Home. I didn't know I was going to be talking about bats with him, but it is bat shed crazy, isn't it? I mean, they've built a bat shed, 100 million quid's worth of bat shed, in order to protect the bats from the HS2 trains, which aren't even actually running yet, and which pose no danger to the bats. Bats all, folks.